Log on, tune in, find out. Another good idea from Cambridge.
Okay, so today we welcome Dr. David Lahti, who's come over from the States. He's Assistant Professor of Biology at Queen's University, Queen's College, the City University of New York. He runs a behavior and evolution laboratory, focusing mainly on learned behavior in birds and humans. And actually, for most of us, one PhD is enough, but Dr. Lahti has two PhDs, one in moral philosophy and the philosophy of biology from Oxford University, and also one in ecology and evolutionary biology from the University of Michigan. So he's exceptionally well qualified to speak to us today on the subject, the evolution of morality. Thank you, Dr. Lahti.
Thank you, Dennis. Thank you all for coming. It's a pleasure to be here. I like the Faraday Institute, and I'm not going to say anything today about how we find out what we ought to do, or how important that is to us. That would be a very different lecture, and one into which I don't think evolution would enter in very much at all. Rather, I'm going to assume that we do try to find out that sort of thing, and ask how we got to be that way, how we got from here to here. This is R.M. Hare, a famous but controversial 20th century moral philosopher. I suppose all philosophers are controversial. But so the question is how we got to be moral beings as far as the evolutionary sciences can tell us at this point. Maybe even slightly beyond what they can tell us at this point. But first, what is morality? I define that as our priority setting machine, our capacity or faculty of determining how to live, and what we use to evaluate our own lives and to pass judgment on our lives and those of others. I'll start with a controversy regarding this question. There are two main realms of ideas, or camps, you might say. I wouldn't want to put any particular thinker solely within one or the other today, I think. But one of them that probably does fit nicely into this category is T.H. Huxley. He thought evolution primarily makes us bad. The ethical progress of society depends on combating our evolutionary nature. The moral lesson, if you will, the moral take-home message of the final chapter of the original Selfish Gene by Dawkins was that we must rebel against the tyranny of our selfish replicators. So the whole book is amoral. In other words, does not try to make a moral claim until we get to talking about the modern human culture, and his conclusion is that we should depart from our evolutionary heritage. And then George Williams, famous evolutionary biologist, recently passed away. He wrote in a paper called Mother Nature is a Wicked Old Witch that the products of evolution and human behavior are largely bad. They largely lead us in ways that we don't want to go. So a lot of people don't think of evolutionary biologists as being moralists, but here we have plenty of moralists within the ranks of professional evolutionary biology. But of course there's another group that has gained a lot more ground in recent years, and that is the group of people who believe that evolution has predominantly made us cooperative, made us nice. Michael Roos, for instance, says famously that altruism is a human adaptation, just as our hands and eyes and teeth are. He was joined in the early years of his theorizing by E.O. Wilson, an evolutionary biologist, who said that morality is a product of the limbic system. It's an excretion of the brain or something like that. Nobody takes that too seriously, and I don't think he even does, but the point is it's part of our biological heritage. It's been fashioned by natural selection. And then there is a diverse group. It's actually two different groups of people that don't speak to each other too much, but the thing that they have in common, evolutionary economists and group selectionists or multi-level selectionists, is that they both talk about humans as primarily being cooperators, acting for the community good. And a lot of the papers that they write and get into science are on how we have become cooperators and acting economically efficiently and for the community good. Now, the problem with a lot of the names that you see, speaking of science, there are a lot of names that have appeared in the journal Science. All of these have appeared there in the last few years to describe humans in some radically new way based on the evolution of morality, essentially, based on the way that the writers of these papers, predominantly scientists who are making controversial forays into philosophy or anthropology, see humans who are either bad humans or fighting humans or good humans or reciprocating humans or efficient humans. But I would propose one come back into use that we used to use for ourselves, which has to do with our capacity as thinking humans, struggling humans. I would suggest that the central evolutionary adaptation with respect to morality is not a disposition to do any particular set of behaviors, good behaviors or bad behaviors, because we are not wholly like that one way or the other. Rather, I believe that our central evolutionary heritage with respect to morality is the capacity to weigh the influences that we do have from our heritage and make a decision among them. So it's actually the struggling or thinking aspect of our nature which is most distinctive about humanity. And one thing that follows from this is that sometimes we have a war within us. This is the fantasy genre's way of representing the battle between good and evil. And this is not only something that we can look at in society, but it's also something that happens within us. We tend to think about this. And that's the germ of truth, I think, behind the diversity of opinion as to what extent we are good or bad in our essentially natural aspects of our nature. In other words, our evolved nature. There are some things we want to do naturally, so to speak, or we have inherited tendencies to do some things that we think are good, and we have inherited tendencies to do other things that we do not think are good. So we have a mixed nature. Now, I'm not asking what good and evil are today, good or bad, right or wrong. I'm rather asking, as a biologist, how we got to this point where we're asking these kinds of questions in general. And so I think the question is best addressed through a narrative. So I'm going to tell you a story that's a multifaceted hypothesis, actually, as to how morality came about in our lineage. I won't distinguish between genetic and cultural evolution. I think that it's not possible to distinguish that in a very specific way with respect to the various aspects of morality that I'm going to present. But you'll see that what I look at as morality as it is a conglomerate of different traits rather than one monolithic trait that came about at one point in our history. And a matter of fact, it uses traits or involves traits that are very old, hundreds of millions of years old, and then also other traits that are still developing today, that we are still trying to think about, not genetically evolving today, but culturally trying to think about and develop new, for instance, ethical approaches to things that we wouldn't possibly have been able to think about even 30 years ago, such as the internet. So I will start just with the general family tree of humans. This is these are the movements of groups of humans in the past, and a timeline going up, starting at 300,000 years ago here. Now, because I define morality as our priority-setting ability, and in more particularly than that, in explicit roles in rule following, in order for them to be explicit, they would have depended on language. I don't think our cognition exploded with the advent of language. I think it's merely a practical necessity that in order to share your ideas about things, you have to be able to exchange information with other people. And so what I call pre-moral is when we were not able, we might have been able to think about things as deeply as we do today. I don't know. But what we do tend to think is that somewhere between 100,000 and 70,000 years ago, language came about, and so that's where I decided to put morality. And at first I call it parochial, and you'll see why I do that. And then universalizing morality, where morality becomes larger than the social group in which it features, and transcending the social group in our ideas of it happens much more recently. So I'm going to run through this timeline rather briefly, relating the way that humans have been organized into social groups, which is over here on the right-hand side, to the evolution of morality, which I'll give you in other ways. So we start off with an individual surrounded by a kin group. That is the very beginning of the story, and I would say that it's so far in the past that we can even say that this is about 135 million years old, that we would have begun to live in kin groups. And the reason I put that date on it is because that's where people think that the mother-child bond, lactation, the reason we're called mammals, first arose in our lineage. Now, I should say that we do have non-relative, there are individuals not in our lineage that have very advanced forms of cooperation, but I'm talking about only in our own lineage here. This is Mara, which is what some biologists think the original mammals would, something like what the original mammals would have looked like. Now, it is the first time, to my knowledge, in our own evolutionary lineage when there is, all the way back to bacteria, that we have a close and enduring bond, we meaning mammals, between two individuals. It predates even the bonds that are present among mostly monogamous animals in caring for their offspring, is just the mother-child bond and lactation. It independently evolved in birds about the same time. So I think it is, in an important sense, the evolutionary root of love, even though we wouldn't necessarily call this love. It's a root from which probably all of our loves have descended through a complex and diverse process down to ourselves. Now, subsequently, we have emotional bonds between parents, for instance, several million years later. Now, William Hamilton in the 1960s developed theory to explain how humans, or how organisms in general, he was focusing mostly on insects, can be selected, naturally selected to care for kin, even non-descendant kin, and so how caring for others can evolve by natural selection. Now that's where things start, but then I think relevant to morality, remember I'm not calling this morality here, these are mere precursors, necessary precursors. The next watershed date, I would say, would be about 9 million years ago, and the reason why I say that is because chimps and gorillas interact with associates in a way that is not predicted solely by kinship, but the other great apes, the Asian great apes, or the orangutan and the other Asian apes, the gibbons, do not. And so that puts this at around 9 to 10 million years ago, that in our lineage we see cooperation among individuals that is not just predicted by kin. It has to do with a relationship between two individuals and a history of their interactions. Robert Trivers in the 1970s developed theory to explain how reciprocity could evolve in animals, taking into account a history of interactions, and evolutionary economists have made great hay out of that since. So we have chimps doing this kind of thing, but then it is here, after our split with our most recent common ancestor, with the chimps, that something very strange and wonderful happens. We get smart. So I have to explain a little bit of this in order to go on. First of all, when did we get smart? All evidence points to a rapid increase in brain size in the human lineage over the last 2 million years. So I'll explain this graph here. Here we have cranial capacity in the thinking part of the brain, the neocortex, and we have time in thousands of years on the x-axis. Here we have the other great apes, which, as you can see, have the same cranial capacity, just about, as Australopithecines. So all of these, I should mention, are skulls, and the cranial capacity of these skulls. The filled diamonds here, before the 2 million year mark, are Australopithecines. And they have cranial capacities that are about on line with the other apes. And then we have, at around 2 million years ago, a ramping up drastically of brain size evolution until we get to about 500,000 years ago. And then we have a second ramping up of brain size evolution. So this is Homo, and then the filled circles at the end there are Homo sapiens, and the evidence suggests that even within the last few thousand years we are still experiencing evolution of higher brain sizes. The average today is pictured by that star there. So the last 2 million years saw, and then the last 500,000 years even more, an explosion of tool use, a decrease of sexual dimorphism, the difference in size between men and women, which suggested sharing of roles and sharing of parenting, an extension of the juvenile period of humans, the length of time in which youngsters are intensively interacting with their parents, and many other traits that are all consistent with a dramatically increased social competition compared to other great apes. Now let's look at this in a different way. Looking at non-human primates here, we have neocortex ratio on the x-axis this time. So by ratio, I mean it's controlled by body size. And mean group size, the number of individuals that one would have to monitor and keep track of and remember interactions with on the y-axis. Humans would be off the chart in both directions. Now, the point here is that it's only the more social primates that have the larger group sizes. It's only the ones with the larger group sizes that grow the bigger brains. And so there is a connection between sociality, group size, and brain size, especially thinking part of the brain. So for humans in general, the emerging consensus, there's still a degree of debate on this, but there's much less than there used to be, is that as we became ecologically dominant, we became, as Darwin suggested, our most hostile force of nature. That's not it yet. And that means what Darwin meant by that, ecological dominance and becoming our own most hostile force of nature, is that in addition to adapting to predators and parasites and hunger and climate, we also, and even more importantly over time, began adapting to an ever-increasing competition with other humans. And this social competition took, and still takes, two general forms. First, competition within groups, and that has historically been, and still is often, for social status and mates. If you look at what our communication is involved in, roughly 85% of the things that we talk about fall into this category still today. And then competition between groups, which is a significant part of our history, not only war, but then less subtle forms of competition as well. And this is associated with within-group cooperation, not only within humans, but in other species. The degree to which there is between-group competition is correlated with the degree to which there is within-group cooperation. And so I believe that that is what happened in our own history as well, and explains how we got this cooperative thing kicked off in a big way in our relatively recent history as we were becoming more intelligent. So this is represented here artistically by Homo habilis, the tool user, came about 2.2 million years ago, and then these scruffy people who are Homo heidelbergensis, and they're being shown here as group hunters because group hunting and the establishment of semi-nomadic rather than nomadic lifestyle came about at about the same time, around 400,000 to 500,000 years ago. And this is, remember, the beginning of the second major increase in brain size. It's not coincidental, I think, that these social changes happened at the same time. All right, then during this period of 100 to 70,000 years ago, where we have a switch to big game, so we're really becoming interactive with each other in order to do this, we have the evolution of language, the importance of language, and the importance of symbolic communication. Most evolutionary linguists think that this is about the time where it would have been possible to convey concepts to one another in a more complex way than it had been possible before. An increase in the hierarchical organization of morality too. We have religion coming on the scene about this time. Some people push it way far back in 70, 80,000 years ago. I think that's probably a little too overstated. Certainly by 40,000 years ago, we have burial with great ceremony, and we have art and figurines that suggest a generalized, at least religious sensibility, an idea of something beyond what humans can see actually existing. And this is in the Welsh National Museum. It's a picture of the Red Lady of Paviland, which is actually a man we found now. But it's red because the person is buried with red ochre, which is in many different cultures has been seen to be a ceremonious practice. But still, okay, we have hierarchical semi-sedentary bands, and we have some type of religion. There are some people who have suggested that ancestor worship is the way that all religion began. I don't know if we know that particularly yet, but it's a good hypothesis. But we're still interacting predominantly with our associates until we get to about this time, when anthropologists tell us that this is when we start to see long-distance travel. We start to see groups interacting with each other more extensively with respect to marriage, with respect to hunting, and with respect to between-group competition or war. There are confederacies that form. Now, when this happens, morality cannot solely be about interacting with associates. It must have a broader notion. And so the idea, I'm following Darwin here with this idea of an expanding circle of moral considerability. He just said it, but I'm picturing it here. The notion of the fellow citizen, I don't think would have had much currency or much importance before humans began interacting with other people from other groups. By the way, this is a priest of the Kwayo people of the Solomon Islands. A lot of island peoples in Indonesia, other peoples where modernity is pushing people to interact with each other to a greater degree than they would have before, are seeing this cultural change right now, in the sense that they have had to accommodate how are we going to deal with other people. Many people have the word humans or people just as the name for themselves, and their morality only tends to apply within their group. But when you have a higher density, when you have a higher level of interaction, when you become semi-sedentary and get to know your neighbors, morality must necessarily extend beyond those. And that's why I'm starting to call this period a period where morality is universalizing. Not only in the sense that the rules are coming from something larger than the social group, because, by the way, that would necessarily have to happen in order for morality to be shared by other people. In order for you to share food or be confederate in war with another group, you have to believe that the rules that you are following are shared in some way, and the sources of them are shared. But not only that, but also that just the level of interaction is greater, which necessitates a shared rule. semi-sedentary lifestyle gave rise in many cultures, not all of course, to a completely sedentary lifestyle. And agriculture, of course, facilitated this. This is the temple of Ur in Sumer. It was built in 2100 BC, so 4,100 years ago. But long before that, at least twice as long ago, we see evidence of agricultural-based societies, civilizations, and most likely they had a chief god that, or a favored god, ultimately an all-powerful god in many societies, of course. And the very first examples of written literature more than 4,000 years ago have this very well developed. Not only the concept of a universal morality, but then also a concept of a universal morality giver. Now, around the same time as we see this literature, starting around 4,000 years ago, and certainly the ideas are much older than that, we also have the idea that we are no longer just puppets of our civilization. We can think individually. Think about the Gilgamesh. Gilgamesh, as he's wandering around, is not content to think in the same way as the rest of his society thinks. He's half God, and that gives us the idea that he has this godly ability to decide for himself what he wants to do. So I have this represented here as the thinker. Now the thinker is able to think about anything one wants with respect to morality. And one of the first things that we see, for instance, it's implicit in Gilgamesh, implicit in the hymn to the Aten of the Egyptian culture, but it's explicit in the Vedas, in some portions of the Bible, and in Greek philosophy, is this idea that all humanity may be of moral considerability. Now this, as Darwin said in The Origin, would have been, no, he said it in Descent of Man, would have been completely unprecedented in evolutionary history. It's the first time on the face of the earth that there was any individual or any species that could even countenance it, never mind bother to think of it. I don't think this probably became important until we were able to share ideas in a very complex way with each other, probably in a sedentary lifestyle. So I think this way of thinking is probably only in the last 10,000 years or so. But certainly we're struggling with it even today. I mean, it's very recently that our culture has outlawed slavery, for instance, and we're still dealing with the possibility, or still dealing with our conviction, putting our conviction into practice, that we believe that all humans are equally morally considerable. To extend this, again, there's another thread in philosophy, in religion, in personal thought about these matters that looks inward. And this would have been relatively unprecedented as well, I think, and that is to think that what one does to oneself could be morally considerable, even what one thinks might be morally considerable, irrespective of its interaction with others. And so, even though I give you a irreducibly social explanation for the evolution of morality, I recognize that morality can burst those bounds and become something that isn't even social. It could be about things that can be good or bad, even within one's own mind. Another way we can burst the bounds, and we have to some extent, of sociality with respect to morality, is that we can think about the possibility of animal ethics, of environmental ethics. In other words, moral responsibilities to entities that don't even interact with us in this Trivers-Alexander sense of a reciprocity. Robert Trivers talking about direct reciprocity, and Richard Alexander talking about indirect reciprocity. I'll get to that later. So we don't even need reciprocity, which some people think, Michael Roos says, is the bedrock of morality. Morality is not fettered by that. Once we have the ability to think for ourselves, you never know where we might go with it. So now that we've finished this history, this crash course, if you will, in anthropology and the history of social or what social psychology suggests would be the history of moral beliefs in interaction with anthropology. The story, I hope, helps us to address the question of why we have this war within us, that moral tension that R.M. Hare was illustrating back then. So one result of our history, especially in the sense of group competition, is a division between self-interest and group interest in our nature. There's a painting by Karachi on the left, and then a painting called by John Russell called The Blind Beggar and His Granddaughter. And so I'm looking at this in terms of this being something to do with self-service, and this being something to do with group service, eliciting those feelings. Now, I think both tendencies evolved by natural selection, and both can be adaptive, but through different routes. The first through competition within a group, looking out for number one, and the second through competition between groups, which has promoted cooperation within a group, and from that we have extrapolated to taking care of the poor and things like this on a cultural level. Now these two mechanisms and these two tendencies conflict with each other, and we often feel this conflict. So human societies, I think this is relatively old in our culture. I mean, we're talking thousands of years, but still, it's relatively old in our culture. And by the way, you can actually look into how long ago this type of thing was done by looking at graves. And if you see people surviving what previously would have been deadly injuries, then you can know that people were taking care of the old, for instance. The two mechanisms often conflict with each other, and so my point is that I think that we have culturally evolved features that help us resolve this conflict between direct self-interest and then our interests in terms of supporting the group on which we depend. Both of which are adaptive, but they're different from each other. So I'll just give you these two solutions that I think are broadly applicable in the human species. Now again, I'm talking from the perspective of natural history here. I'm not talking from the perspective of a moralist or even a moral philosopher. This is purely anthropological here. So I believe we have tended to lean more towards group service goals, being supportive of the group, being committed to the group when the group is threatened. And we have tended to lean more towards self-service goals, towards competitive behavior when the group is stable. Now, group service often involves displays that synchronize and rally our service to the group, our cooperative behavior. We've just seen one example on Remembrance Day, Remembrance Sunday. And this, I would say in general, is the principle of stability-dependent cooperation. This idea that one way that humans have tended to adjudicate between their self-interest and the interests of the groups on which they depend is to go back and forth a little bit on that continuum, depending on how they perceive, how stable they perceive their groups to be. And this is not only from an evolutionary perspective, I say this. There are many books now that have been written on why the countercultural movement happened, why the decline in morality in certain phases of society. It was in Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire, this idea that once a society gets content, then the average young individual becomes less devoted to group service. Now, the second thing that I think, from an evolutionary anthropological perspective, runs morality or runs typical morality on a day-to-day basis is indirect reciprocity. Now, this is when the benefits of being pro-social and the costs of being antisocial come back to the individual not only through individuals with whom you interact, but also from others, from those in power, or from the society as a whole, even. This is from Richard Alexander. So the most important insurance program for this, or enforcement, I should say, enforcement program for this, is reputation, what people think of you. some people through time, including Henry Fielding, thought that reputation was all of morality. He thought it was so important during those days in the 18th century that there was nothing much left besides what people think of you in terms of your decision to do one thing or another. But certainly, even if we look to somewhere else for our reasons as to why we are the way we are, or why we decide to do the things that we do, what people think of us definitely drastically affects our lives, and so drastically affects our behavior. Popular culture echoes this as well, whether to remind us of the importance of reputation, like religious groups can, or if someone is selling something potentially detrimental, a reassurance that, don't worry, it won't affect your reputation. There's a recent Las Vegas-based ad campaign that says what happens in Vegas stays in Vegas. The only reason why that has currency nowadays is because people tend to think that reputation is important, and so before they buy into anything detrimental to their reputation, they want to be assured of privacy, that it will not spread. Hence, this is a lot of the, we try to sell it sometimes, internet privacy, for instance, we try to sell it as something that's about human rights and public service and that kind of thing, but there's probably a lot of this in there too. Okay, so I would say that stability-dependent cooperation and indirect reciprocity run the typical human's morality on a day-to-day basis across the world today. But having said that, I want to introduce a lot of modifiers, because when I first started talking about this, I wanted to leave the modifiers out for the interest of time, but then I always got the same questions at the end, and same comments and criticisms, so I said, well, I have to put them in there at least really briefly. And they are really important. As a matter of fact, some of them aren't so much modifiers as extremely important factors that I have not even included. So for instance, some people, psychologists, would want to look at, why do we have this conscience? You haven't talked about this. What is this thing, and how did the conscience come about? How come there's this tendency to absolutize morality? I've talked about universalizing of morality. And how come we're so slow to change our moral views, and how do you explain them when they do change? Well, a lot of this, I think, can be explained historically in terms of cultural evolution as an insurance policy against sudden threats. So if your views change extremely quickly, and if everything is relative, then you are likely to jump around from view to view, and your society is probably not going to last long. I'm explaining this from over the long view. How come we even have the ability to have these types of things? So moral absolutism is a way of ensuring constancy and universalization of moral rules. It's part of the universalization of morality that I suggested happened when we began to interact more extensively with each other. Moral viscosity, on the other hand, or the slowness to change one's moral views, prevents us from jumping too quickly from group service to self-service in the times of group stability, because it's like a house of cards. Things can be torn down a lot more easily than they can be built up. And so it's important to remain conscientious to some extent, even in times of group stability. And it's asymmetrical in the sense that I predict, and there hasn't been enough social psychological study of this yet, but I predict that humans should be more easily able to jump instantaneously into a position of group service than they would be able to jump instantaneously into a position of self-service, because the threats can be sudden, but stability is slow. So that's a prediction. Deception is another important thing. There are a lot of books written nowadays. Actually, in the last 2 years, there are at least 5 books written on the importance of deception to human morality. And it's not only deceiving of others, my trying to manipulate you into thinking that you ought to be good or ought to do this or that might benefit me, but also my own self-deception, my own tendency to think that I am better than I really am. That helps me get on in life and gives me benefits psychologically. This is extremely important. This interacts with power differentials. Now, some people, such as many Marxists, have believed that this is everything there is about morality. Morality is all about those in power trying to tell others what to do. I don't think that is the case, but I think it is an extremely important and potent phenomenon in the history of morality, and we can't pretend, like I sometimes tend to do implicitly in my timeline of morality, pretend that everything happened in a relatively smooth and peaceful way, in a democratic way. Lastly, and this is the only one that I'll actually go into an example in some detail, is rapid cultural change. Now, I've talked about genetic and cultural evolution and how we can't really distinguish between the two in the evolution of morality yet. Although I can say that things that are a long time, or evolved a long time ago, almost certainly evolved through genetic means, whereas as we become more recent, cultural evolution, and over shorter periods of time, cultural evolution becomes more important. Now, culture can produce surrogates for genetic adaptation. There are things that we do not wait around for genetic evolution to accommodate. So, for instance, this is the example I always use. Sugar. There is a reason why, an evolutionarily sensible reason why we like sweet things, and salty things as well. So sweet things, we need simple carbohydrates, and they are not found everywhere naturally. They're only found certain times in certain places. And so in order for us to eat them in sufficient quantities when we find them, we evolved a predilection for sugar. In species that do not need this, they don't have this. Now, today, because of our predilection for sugar, we have a cultural machine that produces sugar in high quantities, available to anyone who wants it in an extremely concentrated and refined form. So we can get as much of this as we want. And so what have we done? Are we going to wait for genetic evolution to reduce or remove our predilection for sugar? Of course we don't. Instead, our culture steps in. We decide to interfere with our genetic heritage, our evolutionary heritage, and tell our kids through this kind of propaganda not to have so many sweet things, or to brush your teeth, or to stay away from soda, that kind of thing. So this is what I mean when I say cultural surrogates for adaptation. Now, what does that mean in morality? I think many of our cultural institutions today, our morally laden cultural institutions today, are exactly this sort of thing. They are institutions that stand in for genetic adaptation when our evolved or inherited predispositions are at variance with today's society and the things that we want to do in today's society. So, for instance, there is a lot of anthropological evidence, and I can talk about this later, I won't go into it now, that we have not, through genetic evolution, become thoroughly the monogamous species that socially, in our society, we want to be or enforce others to be, primarily because of the importance. When I say primarily, I don't mean in terms of our intentions, but primarily the reason why societies have gone this route is because of the intensity of social competition requiring biparental care. And generally speaking, you do not have fathers staying around to take care of their offspring when in species where there is not a strong mother-father bond. And so in strengthening the family, strengthening the mother-father bond, and of course we have religious and philosophical ways of approaching this and explaining it too. We have things like wedding ceremonies, where all the people who are in direct reciprocity terms most influential in your reputation and most able to influence you. And a matter of fact, in our religious ceremonies, we actually tell those people to influence the two people in a good way. Then we have displays that we put on our hands, in this culture anyway, throughout the rest of our life to do the same thing as when I call home and I say, I'm going to be home at 6. Now that helps me get everything done in a way, because somebody knows that I'm supposed to be home by 6. And so this display, or if I say, yes, I will be there at a certain time, I'm prone to be late. And so if I tell somebody I'm going to be there at a certain time, then it adds a little bit to my willpower. I think these displays add a little bit to the willpower of people who want to go one way with their lives instead of another way. And the only reason to take it off is if you think that you may want to do something else. And so in this case, these moral institutions, they help us move in directions that perhaps our evolutionary heritage is not helping us sufficiently with, or even maybe going against. So this leads well into this last question of why, there are a lot of reasons why R.M. Hare might be frowning, because he doesn't believe in moral realism, but he lives in a world where it's assumed. So, but I want to ask more generally why people frown when they're trying to decide what to do and what to think about morality. I've given you an anthropological story, and just on the basis of that story, there are at least 8 different ways in which conflict comes into the picture in our own minds. Now, we might talk about the philosophy or theology of moral ambiguity, acrasia, weakness of the will, that kind of thing. Now I'm only talking about the natural history of it. What about that? I'm going to list them in roughly increasing order, I think. I struggled with the order, actually. They may not be in the right order, but increasing order of how much I suspect they affect our decisions negatively, so to speak. Not really negatively, because some of them we might like, but in terms of how much they introduce conflict into our decision-making process with respect to what we are going to do and be in our lives. So this is only number 1 in our society. It's certainly not number 1 in many other societies. Remember, I'm saying increasing importance. So in some societies, this would be the top one, and the thing that introduces moral tension, fear of those in power, and we're not saying power disparities. Secondly, we have that group stability insurance function of morality, and stability-dependent cooperation. Now, we don't have perfect knowledge about the stability of our groups, and so we have to think about whether what we are going to do is going to be damaging to that or not, and we tend to make these kinds of decisions sometimes, not as much here as it does in other societies, certainly, but there are many societies where this is primary. Then there are conflicting loyalties to different groups. I gave you a nice, neat, concentric series of circles, but in fact we have workplace social groups, religious social groups, family groups, other groups in which we interact with, political groups in our nations, and those types of things. And these sometimes have conflicting loyalties. And some of our moral tension comes from realizing those loyalties conflict. Then, fourth, we have another sort of uncertainty, both with respect to the thinker thinking about one's own self-deception and the possibility that one is self-deceived, but then also uncertainty about whether one is being deceived by someone else. And you see this a lot in young people, for instance, who are deciding whether or not to follow the moral codes of their parents or not, and the development of independence with regard to those things. Then we have something that I would call an ingrained moral absolutism and viscosity. I'm not saying that people can't get rid of it if they don't want, but it's conscience. It's the slowness to change one's moral views, and it's the tendency to think that one's moral views are applicable in all times and places. When we want to do something, when speaking of it in some terms, temptation, or in other terms, a predilection, comes about to do a certain thing, sometimes even if one has abandoned a particular moral view, intellectually, it may still be there. And likewise, even if one believes that something is wrong, or let's say is permissible, there may be a conscientious objection to it that causes this moral tension. Then there are also uncertainties about reputational impacts. I put this high up on the list because I think that we probably more often than we like to think, and the psychological literature is rife with this, trying to elucidate the extent to which we wonder whether other people are going to find out when we decide to do something. Seventh, conflict between group and individual goals. I already showed you that picture of the two ways in which we can achieve benefits from our behavior. One is by service to the group, and one is by service to the individual and in competition with others in the group, and that leads to conflict as well. And finally, now I'm going on a limb here, but I suspect, and this is just a prediction that can be tested scientifically, I think that the places that we are most at variance with our moral ideas in our society or even as an individual are those areas in which we have inherited predispositions that are contrary to those morals. And so our moral institutions are rebelling against our evolutionary heritage. I think that is the reason why people like George Williams and T.H. Huxley said that Mother Nature is bad, is because they probably sensed that they knew enough about human social behavior to think that the things that they want to do, the desires that they have that they don't agree with, tend to be ones where our evolutionary heritage is at variance with our morality, differs from our morality. And so that's why I suggest tentatively that that is the most conflictual aspect of our nature. Now, where is right and wrong? Usually when someone talks about morality, they talk about good and bad, right and wrong, but I've not been talking about that at all. I've only been talking about morality as a tool, how it arose and grew in complexity as a tool by which we can adjudicate disputes, whether it be in society or even within ourselves. So now, what about right and wrong, good and evil? To what extent can we extract this from the evolutionary story, from these sources of tension? Well, we can try. We can start with this, for instance. We can go back through the sources and see how each relates to our ideas of right and wrong. So now let's take this again. One might think that here we have selfishness and here we have the appeal to generosity, and so maybe goodness in this case is about being more on the right and less on the left. Well, that's okay as far as it goes, but of course we know that feeding ourselves is not morally wrong. It's permissible. It's even good. And matter of fact, feeding of one's own offspring evolved through the same evolutionary mechanism. That belongs, so feeding one's offspring belongs on the left-hand side. If this is the self-service evolutionary mechanism, and this is the group service evolutionary mechanism that I was describing before, then feeding one's own offspring fall over here and caring for one's family. So we can't use that. Whereas on this side of the continuum, this is a picture of Cain and Abel here, killing an innocent human for just jealousy or for any other reason, hurting an innocent person for your own gain, really out of jealousy, is something that we would consider evil or bad, and it evolved by the same mechanism as eating did. General evolutionary mechanism. And yet on the other side, on the group service side, it's this is a woodcut of an abolitionist. Xenophobia, racism, slavery. Well, slavery is concomitant to that, but xenophobia and racism are thought to have evolved and be common in the human species, culturally evolved and become common, precisely for a group benefit. It increases group competition and therefore increases group cohesiveness. And yet we would consider slavery to be wrong. So there are things that evolve through the group service mechanism and things that evolve through the self-service mechanism that cut across this distinction of good and bad. So the result is here that we cannot extract, at least from this, and I think if we went through all of those sources of moral tension, we cannot extract right and wrong from this anthropological story. The product of evolution whether cultural or genetic, our traits don't judge us, we judge them. In some cases, we might decide to build upon the raw materials that evolution has provided us, and in other cases, we might decide to combat it. So my final point. Today I've talked a lot about psychological and behavioral tendencies and how I think they came about and what it means for how our morality tends to operate. And tends is the crucial word here. I've been talking about averages, general trends, typical outcomes. That's what biologists are interested in. They're interested in generalities, and they want something to explain the generality. The exceptions are points off of the line. They might occur for a variety of reasons, but they're not the main story. That's the biological way of thinking about things. Maybe that's even this general scientific way of thinking about things. We're interested in the generalities. Now, in a sense, when we talk about morality, all of this completely misses the point. So, for instance, Socrates is an exception here with respect to morality. This is Jacques-Louis David, Death of Socrates. He takes the deadly cup of hemlock rather than give up teaching what he believes to be true, including the idea that we ought to be committed more to divine goodness than to the authority of man. That's an exceptional moral view, and he displays here an exceptional level of moral commitment to it. Now, with respect to morality, contrary to the way science works, I believe that the stories and the examples that are most interesting, most inspiring, and ultimately most important to us are precisely the exceptions like this, rather than the averages. And the reason for this is that the very essence of the idea of goodness is to rise above the type or trend, to rise above our influences in our history. Thank you.
Thank you very much, David. I'm sure there are plenty of questions, and we'll start on the front row. Yeah.
So right about, you say that's unusual, and the sources I'm more interested in, the origins, entail, at this stage, possible several traits, which include, for example, sense of humility, respect for others' rights, human, anything else. It's fundamental respect, and respect for something beyond oneself. It's to me, I haven't really reconciled how that's almost like self-interest, self-preservation is subject to one's capacity to work, the greater, the good beyond.
Well,
and what's the origin of it? It's a link to my effort to try to understand the fundamental religiosity of altruism as well.
yeah, so,
Repeat the question, David.
right, so the question is, how do things like other regard, altruism, care for others, humility, how do these things feature into this story? And I would...
Evolved.
Right. How do they have evolved, specifically when evolution is driven primarily by natural selection? Well, I would say that just as I started out the story talking about the first mammals and how lactation facilitated the first emotional bond between two individuals that we see in our lineage, that is the root right there, the beginning of when we see care for another individual. And so we have a nature that includes we have an evolved nature that includes aspects of all of these
It's
things.
almost automatic. It's almost
Much of it is, but much of it
yeah.
needs to be trained and molded as well.
Okay, another question? Please. Sorry.
Yeah, please. A few words, please, on the place of the moral injunction, love your enemies. It's linked to that question.
Love your enemies.
Yeah.
Yeah. So I think you're taking that from Jesus, although there are many other people who have said that sort of thing. There are any number of ways, and we can talk about this as economists, or we can talk about this in terms of evolutionary anthropology. I would say that there are many reasons why loving your enemies can be a good idea. In terms of in emotional anthropology, if you will, those who are kind to everyone demonstrate their kindness in a much stronger way than those who are kind only to those who are kind to them. And so there are evolutionary reasons to expect, and also just personal, rational reasons to expect that people who cultivate a general attitude of kindness are more to be trusted and are perhaps better people in ways that we value than people who love only those who love them. But I have to recognize that morality, again, can burst the bounds of what is evolutionary economical or anthropologically sensible. And I do not doubt that there are ways in which loving your enemies can be detrimental. But as I said, there's no saying that we have to accept moral injunctions purely on the basis of their heritage or their biological sensibility. If we want to love our enemies for whatever reason, and it doesn't have a biological basis, so be it.
Please.
Allowing for what you said about averages, I've kept on thinking as you've been talking about a paedophile, where all the accepting that while we're the same species, it's hopefully the exception, when all those deterrents that you listed just don't figure,
Mm-hmm.
and something physical, super, it comes in. I just wondered what you...
Right. Yeah, I was concentrating in that last bit on the positive exceptions from a moral point of view. But of course there are going to be negative or morally bad exceptions too, in the sense that we would perceive those behaviors. So it's human behavior and human psychology is a bell curve, where people can lie off the line in various ways, to both. In both ways with respect to our moral actions and even the temptations that we face or the predilections that we have. So even though I've talked about, even in other species, in humans even to a greater extent, because we have so much influence of our cultures and our experience, even other species, when you talk about their behaviors and talk about their influences, that's only talking about the majority. And so when we say that the northern cardinal, a bird in North America, an all-red bird, always hangs around with its mate and is monogamous. There are exceptions. There are exceptions even within the northern cardinal. There are ones that never find a mate, but then there are also ones that there are males that try to attract a second mate, and there are females that do not hang around with males. And so if that is the case, even for birds, it is going to be even more the case in a culturally sensitive species like humans.
See, I'd just like to ask, I'm going to take Chairman's prerogative and ask a final brief question, then we'll have to stop, I think. And that is, just coming back to this question earlier on, loving our neighbour as yourself and that sort of thing. Isn't the problem, I think you sort of hinted at this, but I think one of the problems that evolutionary biologists always have in this field is, what actually Stephen Jay Gould really calls just so stories. In other words, there's always going to be the possibility of explaining it. You can think of loving our neighbour as yourself, well, could be a sign of weakness, so you get killed, so that's not adaptive, but in other contexts it could be quite adaptive because they wouldn't fight you anymore, and so on. You can come up with some sort of story. How do you think, what kind of data are going to come along to sort of distinguish between these sort of different kinds of stories? Would you see cognitive psychology as the main hope for this whole field, more than social structures of 40,000 years ago? What do you think?
Well, it depends on what kinds of questions you want to ask. I think cognitive psychology won't be very helpful in determining whether, for instance, loving one's neighbor as oneself has been important in our history in terms of molding who we are as a species, but I think it may be important in determining what we are like right now, and whether we respond to that positively or negatively, and in what way we respond. But I do think that the idea of a just so story is a little bit of a mischaracterization for the most part. I mean, I think that evolutionary biology, I should say, there is a branch of evolutionary biology that is evolutionary philosophy, really. In what it is, it's the production of hypotheses, because humans are so complex and the evolutionary process is so complex that sometimes you need whole careers spent just on the manufacture and development of decent hypotheses that explain all observations to date and have falsifiable predictions. That some people are just good at that. Robert Trivers is an example of that, and Richard Alexander is an example of that. And so these people aren't doing just so stories, they're creating hypotheses that are consistent with known data and have, if they are good at it, falsifiable predictions. And that's what we really need to look for in this case. So if whether loving your neighbor as yourself or loving your enemies is adaptive, and how long ago it was, is an empirical question, and we need to try, if we can, to develop some predictions that would show when it would have been and when it would not have been.
Okay, thanks. Well, we do try and stop that too, but I think we do want to thank David Lahti very much for a fascinating talk. So thank you.